Thank you. I do a lot of things, and I am kind of excessive. That's all really true, which is going to be proven by the intro to the show tonight. How's everybody doing? You can try that again. How is everybody doing? So much better. So we're talking about anger tonight. Has anyone out here ever been angry? Oh, whew. Well, that is a bucket of worms I'm not going to touch. But anger is an emotion. It is a thing that we all kind of grow into from childhood, right? Like kids get angry when they're small and they can't communicate. Children get angry when they don't understand the injustices of the world. Like, why do I have to eat this broccoli? Suddenly in high school, you're angry because everything is wrong about the government, the world is wrong, and parents are unfair even though they're paying for everything. Anger is a thing that we go throughout our lives that is based in some kind of moral code, some ethics, something we believe in, right? Like there's a barometer. There's a reason why we're angry that surpasses what we think is acceptable, or sometimes what we don't know yet that we believe in. So has anyone ever been angry at a thing and just don't know why? So my story about anger is very interesting because the story about anger is actually how I ended up in New York, tangentially, not directly. So once upon a time, I was a baby legislative aide on Capitol Hill. I worked for a senator who I won't name, but she was awesome and great. We disagreed on a lot of things. And while I was working there, one of the things that I thought was very cool about my job is that I was a legislative aide for justice, which encompassed a lot of things. Incarceration, the right to vote, drug deterrent programs, all of these things that aren't exactly the sexiest thing in the world, but to me were very important because I grew up in a family that as soon as you were able to vote, you went and registered. Family, they voted together. My grandfather fought after integration to ensure that there was money still going into the Black community, which made him a target. And so, you know, this was a thing that we grew up that was very important to us. And so now this kid who didn't mean to work in politics, because I always hated politics, was working on justice issues. Because, you know, you grow up with the old adage, politicians are no good. But I thought that I was doing a good thing by being able to be there, to be in the mix, to deal with legislative policy. Well, in my third year of working on the Hill, which consequently was my last year of working on the Hill, a bill came to pass that would allow former incarcerated convicts the right to vote automatically. None of this, I gotta pay my fees. And it would give them the legal right to sue a state that would not put them automatically back on the rolls. It was like Christmas to me. I was like, this is the best thing. Disenfranchised voters automatically, they get the right to vote. This is the best thing. I run into my legislative director's office and I said, we gotta sign on to this. Who asked us? Okay. I mean, it's just the right thing to do. 1 out of 8 people in the state of Louisiana are affected by this. I think this would be great. Who asked us? All right, so I go back, my little hopeful self. I get people to send in letters, give me facts, show the impact. And then eventually, long story short, we never sign on to this bill. And I got angry. I got real angry. It was the first time I had gotten real angry in a real long time because I thought that by working on the Hill, I was doing something good, that I was being responsive, that I was aiding the folks in the great state of Louisiana. And so I decided to quit my job. It was very impulsive of me, but I was ready to go. Because as an attorney with 2 degrees, you think that I'm supposed to be doing something better. I have a higher calling. Like, my grandfather would have been ashamed of me for not going to do something better. And so I went down to North Carolina and I joined a presidential campaign to go register folks to vote. I moved to a place I'd never been, signed my lease apartment sight unseen, and went down and registered with my team of 30 odd people, thousands of people to vote. in the great state of North Carolina and I say the great state because that's what they say, in 2012. And for me, I tell this story because it was a case for me where anger motivated me impulsively to change my life. Because I had a job that most people would give a leg, an arm, a kidney to get. I was a legislative aide on Capitol Hill. And I spent the next year of my life standing outside of various shops registering people to vote. And for me, that was a thing that was productive for my anger. And I then spent the next 3 years doing campaign politics. Anger is a thing that is malleable. It is a thing that sometimes is good and sometimes is bad, and sometimes we can't explain it. And particularly in an information age when we are dealing with this concept of constantly being on the information highway, does anybody seem to get angry a lot more often than they remember getting angry ever in their entire life? Do you remember what you were doing were you looking at your phone? Were you paying attention to the news? Is there something that you saw? And do you feel like it's something that sometimes you can't explain? Like it's almost like, oh, I'm angry. And then suddenly you are typing, per my last email, first of all, or you're making a donation, or you're signing a petition, or you're joining an advocacy group. Anger is a thing that exists in all of us, but the question is, why are we so angry right now? So tonight, and I'm gonna get my little cheat sheet of amazing names over here. Tonight, we brought in some people who are way smarter than me, who are experts in a number of things to talk about why are we so angry right now. And I'm excited because we've got Tim Wu, who, for most of you who don't know Tim Wu, I kind of fangirled a little bit because he basically coined net neutrality, which is a big deal for a telecom nerd. So he'll be coming out. He's also written a number of books, continues to do amazing work, has worked for the White House, and he's going to be talking about the information and digital age and how that has an impact on communication and anger. And then we're going to get a little bit nerdy. Jayvon Bayville is going to come out and talk about the neuropsychology of anger and impulse and groupthink. Again, back to that Twitter response that you really wanted to send, but then you think about it and you're like, but what is this really going to do? Send anyway. And then we're going to have two amazing advocates and policy experts who are going to come out, Nyira and Rashad Robinson, who are going to talk about the practical impacts and effects of anger. And what does that look like when we deal with things that we believe in and we deal with building movements and community. And I'm really excited because, spoiler alert, friends with both of these folks and worked with them for a very long time, and they have really rode the wave of media and anger and done some really productive things with it, depending on what perspective you're in when it comes to anger. And so I'm excited to announce you've heard enough from me. Hopefully you have more questions now than you did when you walked in. That's my job. I would like to introduce our first guest who is going to be coming to the stage. Tim Wu is an author, information and policy advocate, and professor at Columbia Law School. Wu's best known for his work and development in coining the concept term net neutrality theory, but he also writes about private power, free speech, copyright, and antitrust. His books, The Master Switch and The Intention Merchants, have won wide recognition and awards. If you have not read them, you should. And Wu has worked at academia, federal and state government, including the White House's National Economic Council, the Federal Trade Commission, and the New York Attorney General. He also contributes to the New York Times. There's a number of things. So I'm excited to bring to the stage Tim Wu. I'll give you a second to adjust your mic.
Yeah.
How you doing?
Very good. Have you made a lot of anger jokes already?
I have made some anger jokes, but a
Okay.
secret that all of you should know about me, I love a good pun.
Okay.
So the punnier, the better. I also love a good dad joke. So any jokes you would like to add to this, please do.
Well, I was just trying to say I sort of feel calm, which probably is the wrong feeling for this, but I'll try to step it up a little bit.
I feel like you can be, I mean, Bruce Banner is always angry,
Right.
so that works, right?
Yeah.
So it would not be a far stretch to say you have studied the internet.
Yes, that is fair to say. Lived it, grown up with it.
Well, a lot of us have grown up with it.
Yeah, that's true.
It's. I don't think it for a lot of us, in what happened in 1983 and this expansion out, like none of us could have really conceived
Right.
that we'd go from like going to the internet
Yeah.
to our internet being in our pocket.
Yes.
And it's very interesting in that, many folks who are growing up now from Generation Y don't have this concept of going to the internet. But like you have studied at length the idea.
I think what they don't have is the concept of not being on the internet. You know what I mean?
Right,
I think
they're
it's the other way
always-
around.
they're
It's
always there.
a little jacked in. Yeah.
Well, and they're always there because they
Yeah.
do their work there. They do their schooling there. They answer emails. For you, being a person who's observed the internet for the last, I won't even say how many years. What does the internet really mean for how we communicate?
Wow, that's a deep question. In other words, not what I was expecting. I think I think it has been in some ways like one of these stories where getting what you asked for ends up being not quite what you thought. So the dream in the 80s and 90s was that the internet was going to disintermediate everything. Everyone was going to be able to speak. It was not just going to be a couple journalists and
The idea of
gatekeepers.
democratization of
total
media.
democratization of media. And I don't think we fully guessed what the ramifications would be of that for the republic, for democracy, for warfare, for culture, just about for everything. I think everyone kind of assumed, well, once you give everyone a voice, that's the greatest. And once you have an opportunity, a situation, or a setup where anyone can kind of reach anyone, well, that's got to be better, unless it happens to be someone from the Midwest who's actually a Russian robot whose idea is they want to make you furious because, in fact, Hillary Clinton is rounding up children for something, or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's the thing is in a way we got what we asked for, but it ended up being much different than we thought.
Which is interesting because arguably, and what has really been in contention is like who owns the internet, like
Right.
who really has this possession, because it's all really based on platforms. The information for most folks comes from these platforms, these vehicles of how we communicate. Do you feel like what we got, it's pace, because I won't even say it's depth, because a lot of times it doesn't go too deep. But the pace that we get information, the places that we get information, and definitely kind of what you touched on right there was this concept of the veracity of the information.
Right. I mean, there's so much to talk about here, but I think that, so the first thing I said that I think has changed, where we got what we wanted, was this ease of the communication, the light. It doesn't necessarily mean you can reach everyone, but you can at least sort of get yourself out there, and that went in different directions than we thought. But also, yes, I'd say it would also be surprising, even to someone from 30 years ago, how often we are just on the receiving end of communications, efforts to get our attention. Many people, if this is you, don't feel ashamed, sleep with their telephones. And so the last thing they see when they go to bed is the internet, and the first thing they see when they wake up. So it's sort of a cocoon that you live in. And if you walk down the street holding your phone, and if you can very possibly come close to being half robot in a way. If you it's hard to say that phone isn't actually part of you. If it is with you from the morning you wake up. If it is what you are looking at on the subway, walking down the street and so on, I mean, that's kind of you and that's kind of your world. So I'd say that's a little different. I mean, people used to watch a lot of TV. I won't deny that.
Well,
Yeah.
TV was, that's the other revolution, right? You have the
Yeah.
television revolution and the internet revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And they've both intrinsically impacted each other. I think it's interesting what you're saying. Do you think, from your study and the work that you've done, that this type of cocoon that's been created, kind of in this idea of outrage and call-out culture and tweeting and the sharing, the quick sharing, like the feeling of you need to share immediately of stuff, has changed or increased the amount of human emotion that gets expressed?
I think the answer is yes, but I think to understand why, I think we need to get to business models a little bit. And this does go to this point about me growing up in the internet. I can still remember, now I was a high school geek, grade A, like Dungeons and Dragons, the whole deal. And
I'm here for this.
Dial-up modem. And so I was, in fact, I worked as a programmer in the 80s. And so there I was on the early internet. And, it was basically other geeks. And there was, in fact, commerce at that point was banned. There was not ever to be used for commercial, it was a nonprofit government network. And it was, it had its weaknesses, but I wouldn't say it was like entertaining by today's standards, unless you were interested in having a debate on the relative merits of Dungeons and Dragons versus whatever, but you know what I mean, or different types of giant or something. But no, it was non-commercial. It was kind of like folk. Yeah. And let's move to the 90s when it got a little more popular. It was very folky, kind of a lot of stuff. I think getting eventually to our topic, there came a time where the companies on the internet wanted to make money. And they had kind of not fully figured that out. And they wanted everything to be free. And then someone figured out how to do advertising. That someone was Google, just to make it clear. They figured out advertising.
Spoiler alert,
and
it was Google.
They figured out advertising, the first to really make. And so then it all became about keeping people coming back, trying to give them that lift or that feeling.
How do you still their eyes? How do you get the attention?
Yes, how do you get attention? It became the attention economy, the battle to sort of keep people there and keep people coming back. One of the things, I don't want to go on a huge, I might get too academic, but I think the check-in, the idea of getting people to feel, maybe you can study your own mind and ask, do you feel some vague itch to check in to, look at your phone, either look at email
25
or Facebook
times a day,
or Instagram, or that's 20 to 25 is not bad. But do you have some sense that you have to, that ritual, cultivation of that ritual became very important. That's one. And number two, sharing was so important for so many of these business models, especially Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And I may be jumping ahead here a little bit, but sharing depends heavily on high arousal emotions. And there's a number that work, joy and awe, but what is the tried and true way to get people to share stuff? Anger. So I think that's what leads us. And I would be surprised if there's not someone in this room or someone listening who has not had this experience where they just feel angry and they have to share it with somebody. I don't know why. They have to tell somebody else what they're angry at. Can you believe this happened? And that drives, I don't know, I wish you could kind of quantify what percentage of internet traffic is driven by, can you believe it? Or
and I'm excited because we're going to be talking to Jay in a second about this neuropsychology of what it means to have this reaction, this impulse. Before we end this segment, though, does anyone I got time for one question. Does anyone have a dying question that they would like to ask Tim before?
Sure.
We're going to get a mic for you to make sure everybody at home.
So you were talking about the ritual of people coming back to the internet, so I was wondering, do you think that also is inherent, or is there something really natural in man to like be drawn into this like cyclical cycle? I mean, I don't know if it was necessarily just Google or a company alone that.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I got interested in this in the Attention Merchants book, and there's slightly different things. The ritual is one thing. I think that was actually really important for television, where you have a moment where you do something, and sometimes some of the internet stuff is ritualistic. But I think the internet companies have been more successful with the building of addictions, kind of like an itch, a habit. You have to get back to it. You sometimes lose control of yourself. That depends, to my mind. I'm not a psychologist, so I should defer to the next speaker. But I was really interested when I was writing my book about the experiments on rats and pigeons, where they give them uneven reward schedules. You know, they pull. If you push on a lever, you get a biscuit. That's somewhat attractive. Eventually, they'll lose interest. But if you push on something and then occasionally it gives you something, that really gets people addicted. And it's a little bit like a slot machine, but it's also a lot like email and a lot like Facebook. As often it's just like kind of a downer, but occasionally you get something amazing. And I think that has been cultivated very carefully and is at the core of some of the business models of the biggest companies in the world.
Wow. I wish that we could talk to you for like another 2 hours, and I feel like we will talk again. But thank you so very much.
Yeah, pleasure.
This is amazing.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. So next up, we are going to be bringing out someone who will be talking a little bit about the concept of these impulses. Jayvon Bayville is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at New York University and director of the Social Perception and Evaluation Lab. For neurons to social networks, Jay's research examines how collective concerns, group identities, moral values, and political beliefs shape the mind and brain. The work addresses issues of group identity, social motivation, cooperation, implicit bias, moral judgment and decision-making, and group regulation from a social neuroscience perspective. So I'm actually really excited to talk to him. I don't know if you can tell by my inability to use words, to kind of continue this conversation about our reactions, how we think about or don't think about how we react to the certain things that we see and why this invokes anger. So I'd like to bring to the stage Jayvon Bayville. Hi.
Hey, how's it going?
Oh, well, you know, just sitting here talking about anger.
I love to talk about anger.
You seem so calm.
We live in the age of anger. This is the age of moral outrage is probably the way I'd put it.
Talk to me more about that.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the research that we do on this. So as you mentioned, people can't help now but express their anger about all kinds of things. And the interesting thing about being a scientist in this era is that we can study it in real time. We can download hundreds of thousands of messages that people are posting online on Twitter or Facebook and start to understand what are the patterns and why are people doing this and what are the responses when they do it.
So what are the patterns you've seen?
So the pattern that we see is that when people use moral emotional words, when they're talking about political issues like climate change, gun control, same-sex marriage, for every word that people use like that in a tweet, there's about a 20% greater chance it will get retweeted. And so if you load up your messages with 3 or 4 or 5 words like that, you double the chance that it's going to spread or go viral.
You literally just made a whole lot of social media managers' jobs so much easier.
So that's the incentive for you to do it, right? And marketers and social media managers and activists can leverage that. The other thing that we find when we map out who's retweeting it, when people use that language, it's getting spread further, but only in an echo chamber. So liberals are only start to share things from other liberals. Conservatives only share messages from other conservatives when they use that language. When they use different types of language, there's more crosstalk or sharing more broadly.
So this is interesting. So a lot of folks, this may be their first time hearing this term, echo chamber.
Yeah.
It's not my first because it is used kind of as a buzzword a little bit, particularly within these circles. Mm-hmm. Is there a benefit? Is there a danger? Is there a consequence of there being just this sharing within these echo chambers and not this crosstalk?
So there's certain benefits to it. If you want to mobilize people like you, then it's good to talk to people who are like-minded and get them fired up. If you want to have a broader impact or maybe persuade people who are different from you or understand what they're thinking, then you're cutting yourself off from those people. If you cultivate a little echo chamber or use language that only resonates with people like yourself. So it's kind of a double-edged sword.
So there's this idea of cooperation, though, right? When you want to have this crosstalk, when you want to use these different words, what are the keys to cooperation? You've kind of talked about using different words, but let's dive into what that means.
So when we think about cooperation, what cooperation means is that you're willing to often sacrifice something for yourself to help a bigger good. That bigger good is determined in part by the identity that you create for yourself. So if you define yourself in this very narrow cluster of people, so for example, if you take the Democratic primary right now, if you're really committed to one candidate and you're not willing to support any other candidates, you're defining your identity really narrowly in that group. If you decide I want to support this person, but if they lose, I'm going to support the whole party, then you're defining your identity more broadly. And so cooperation first requires a question of cooperate with whom? And that's not an easy question for people to answer, and it's fraught with all kinds of other issues.
It seems, and in this kind of a little bit of a devil's advocate, it seems that when you create these echo chambers, you're just yelling at the wall because you're talking to people who agree with you within the same echo chamber, and it's not really making an impact. Do you feel like this is having a negative I hate use the word impact again, but do you feel like it's having a negative impact on the larger conversation? Yeah,
so one of the potential problems is that it can polarize conversations. And so what it can mean is that only more and more voices that are more and more towards the edges or the extremes of a viewpoint get heard. Yeah. And in fact, that's what happens on Twitter. It's only 2 or 3% of people who are carrying half of the conversation on these topics. And they tend to be from people who are at the extremes. If you look at the number of followers on social media that members of Senate have, as you get to the more ideologically extreme candidates, they actually have bigger followings. So there's all these incentive structures embedded in being extreme in the modern media ecosphere that we live in.
What I'm hearing is that anger is being incentivized.
It is incentivized. It's also monetarily incentivized. So if you have a blog and you want to get a bunch of clicks, or you are a social media platform and you want to keep people engaged and online, whatever you can do to amplify discussion, sharing, engagement, any type of emotional engagement with people on the platform is going to keep you online longer, and you're going to make more money off of it.
So it's interesting to me because we've talked a lot about online. Do you see that this is being translated into actual actions and mobilization and movement? Because I'm very excited because we're going to talk more about this with Rashad and Nyira, but do you see in your study that this is being translated offline, or is this something that is just very unique to social and digital media?
So there are a few studies on this, and there is evidence that our discussions on things like social media can lead to real social change. So the classic example was the role of Twitter in the Arab Spring for coordinating against regimes where you couldn't otherwise use public media to discuss real issues. So it can be mobilized for good. It can also be weaponized against you. So we have studies looking at the language of Russian trolls, and they are off the charts with their moral emotions, especially negative language. And they use the most polarizing terms that we have seen. So what they're trying to do is pull people apart to create conflict. So they're trying to create action, but negative action, so that people despise each other more, even if it's partly artificially constructed because it's not coming from real people with genuine concerns. We don't know that when we see someone talking to us often on social media.
So I'd love to open up for 1 or 2 questions because I am sure this conversation has produced one of those. Does anyone have questions in the audience? Get a mic to the front row.
So with this discussion, I guess the question that has to come to my mind, because I'm actually from the generation that precedes all of this, is at what point do we as a society determine how to, I guess the word would be filter or something to get the benefit of the internet rather than be overwhelmed by the negative aspect?
Yeah, so there's, how does society decide to do this? So there's two levels. At least two levels, probably three or four. The first is, as an individual, you get to decide what you share online, who you follow, and what type of voices you follow, and what type of voices you amplify. We also, I guess, collectively have a role in pressuring companies to develop platforms that produce better collective outcomes for society. So if we are supporting platforms that are harmful to democracy or harmful to certain groups, that might be something that we as a society decide that we need to regulate or engage in other types of action to pressure them to change. So I'll give you an example of how this plays out with different media companies. One case of it is that Facebook has an algorithm that decides what order and who you see in your feed when you log in. It turns out people scroll through about 300 feet of social media a day. So if you have your iPhone and you're scrolling every time, that's about 5 or 6 inches. So you scroll about 600 times through per day. And they want stuff that's going to grab your attention. And we found in our lab that the moral emotional language pops out. You see it more easily, and therefore you can act on it. And so to have that work in the attention economy of social media, they have an algorithm that often feeds up highly emotionally triggering things for people and triggers anger. They started to change their algorithm once they realized it potentially had some negative consequences for fake news and things like that. Twitter went in the opposite direction. So Twitter in the old days used to just have chronological information. And now that's not the default. The default is whatever's trending, even among people you don't follow. And so what do you think that content is? It's often stuff that's highly emotionally laden, evokes anger, is polarizing. And now it's really hard if you log in and you're trying to figure out how to change the default back to the chronological. And why they've done that is they make more money off of it. And so they have incentives that are basically oriented toward turning people against one another. And it's very costly for them to go in the opposite direction. But you have to think there might be some long-term cost to them if they don't change sooner than later. But in the short term, that's profitable.
Wow. Wow. Does anyone else have any questions?
So are you saying, aside from like a moral imperative that we should think about the long term, there's no way to discourage the extreme views and the polarizing language and actions?
Yeah, so I think there's other ways we can discourage it. So it's possible to discourage it among people who are your friends. So normally if you're having dinner with a friend and they're going on some conspiracy theory rant, you can roll your eyes or say you have to leave early and they get the message. But online, you often don't see the eye rolls that you see in a real human conversation, or the leaning back or the disengagement. You just see the likes and the retweets. Occasionally, you might see a comment. But what is happening is that by not being able to see the negative feedback as much on social media, at least the subtle things from people who are in our network, our community, our friends, we have to realize that we might want to tell people or give them a nudge when they're doing things that might be alienating large swaths of people, because they're only getting the positive feedback. And so if you say something that 10 people love and 100 people hate, you're going to see 10 likes. But if you say something that 5 people love and 0 people hate, you only see 5 likes. And so what people see as reinforcement is things that reinforce polarizing and potentially harmful to their community language and content and discourse. And so it's incumbent upon us to just set good social norms by signaling to others and setting a model. So that's just the first thing that we can do in our own community, but people aren't otherwise getting that feedback that they normally get in real human interactions with another person sitting across from you.
Wow. And it's so interesting because now they've got the unfollow, which I feel like is the digital way of saying, hey man, chill out. Yeah. But it's interesting when you think about this concept of groupthink. Well, I want to thank you so very much
Thanks.
I have like 12 other questions to ask you, but I have no more time.
Okay, I'll come back and we'll talk more about it later.
Please do. Would love to have you. Again, another round of applause for Jay.
Thanks.
Thank you. So the next portion of our show, I'm very excited because we actually have a performance section this evening. We're going to have a performance by Miriam El-Hajli, a Venezuelan Moroccan American composer and vocalist. So we kind of talked about this concept of adding in a performance aspect and wanted to have a good fit. We wanted to address anger and outrage from a variety of angles, at least what we could do in 75 minutes, because anger is big and large and varied and not a monolith. And Miriam's work really, it beautifully tackles those difficult emotions, channeling folk traditions from South and North America, jazz and contemporary classical styles, to this really great effect. So I am really excited that she's going to come out and play a couple pieces for y'all while we take a little bit of a break before our last segment. I want to bring to the stage Miriam El-Hajli.
Good evening. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm going to start off with a song that's called Deportee. That was originally written by Woody Guthrie, though I've changed it a bit to fit, I don't know, the larger context of my own life or the lives of others.
Peaches are rotting, the oranges are piled in their creosote dumps, and they're taking you back to the Mexican border. Oh, to spend all your money to get back again. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adiós mis amigos Jesús y María. You won't have your names when you ride the big airplanes. All they will call you will be deportee. Oh, my mother's own mother, she waded that river, and they took all the money she made in her life. Oh, my brothers and sisters gave birth to this country, but their justice and their freedom will still be denied. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adiós a mis amigos, a Jesús y a María. You won't have your names when you ride the big airplane. All they will call you will be deportee. And the airplane caught fire over Los Gatos Canyon, a fireball of lightning that shook all the hills. And who are these friends that are falling like dried leaves? Oh, the radio says that they're just deportees. Goodbye to my Juan, goodbye Rosalita, adiós a mis amigos Jesús y a María. You won't have your names when you ride the big airplanes. All they will call you will be deportee.
Thank you. This next song I'm gonna play is a song I wrote last year called Gold and God, and I was thinking a lot about when the Spanish and the French that attempted, and the British, when they all came to North America specifically, they colonized all the Americas, but I'm specifically talking about North America, and the tragedy and the genocide that occurred, and yeah, the indigenous people that were killed, and specifically thinking about what they came here looking for gold and for God, in a sense, thinking in a way that they were God's chosen people, and the power and privilege that can distort in people and make them think it's okay to occupy others' lands and to commit brutality and atrocities. So this is a song thinking about those things. Thank you. All right. Thanks for listening. I'm going to play one last song. That is a song I recently heard this past week. I've been on a sort of regional tour with a dear friend, and we were playing in prisons, in women's prisons upstate, and she taught me this song. It's called Rabo de Nube, and it's a song by a very, very, really, I respect him so much, sort of a singer-songwriter who led the La Nueva Trova movement in Cuba, Silvio Rodriguez. And yeah, what a poet, man. But anywho, this is a song of his for anyone who speaks Spanish, but if not, just, listen to the harmonies and the emotion, and you'll understand what it's about. And, in a very poetical way, he is saying that he's wishing hope for the people when all there seems to be is really bleak hopelessness. But yeah, rabo de nube. Thank you.
Si me dijeran, pide un deseo, preferiría un rabo de nube, un torbellino en el suelo y una gran ira que sube, un barredor de tristezas y un aguacero en venganza que cuando escape parece nuestra esperanza. Un barredor de tristezas y un aguacero en venganza que cuando escampe parezca nuestra esperanza. Si me dijeran pide un deseo, yo preferiría un rabo de nube que se llevara lo feo y nos dejara al querube, un barredor de tristezas y un aguacero en venganza que cuando escampe parezca nuestra esperanza. Un barredor de tristezas y un aguacero en venganza que cuando escampe parezca nuestra esperanza.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Okay, yes.
I get another round of applause for Miriam. As I sneak back on stage. Wow. This has been an incredible night, and I'm really excited to end the evening with two folks who I've known for a while, so I'm slightly biased about the next two folks we're bringing up, just because we have met within organizing spaces, but also because they both bring very unique perspectives to the idea of organizing and movement building on a policy level, on a digital level. Yep, I'm totally sitting here like given time for the setup to happen, guys. It's what's happening. I see all of you kind of looking at the mics and I'm like, yeah, I am definitely perfect. Great. So Rashad Robinson is the president of Color of Change, a leading online racial justice organization. The organization was founded after Hurricane Katrina and has a stated mission of strengthening political and cultural power of Black communities in America and making government and corporate leaders more responsive to their concerns. Under Robinson's leadership, Color of Change has grown by 1 million members and expanded to 4 offices in New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and Oakland, California, and exponentially expanded their digital campaigns pursuing racial justice. Nyira Hawk is a Sirius XM talk show host, television commentator, and an international public affairs consultant. She leads AM and PM drive talk conversations in response to breaking news and is a regular television guest of hosts such as HBO's Bill Maher, Brian Williams, Chris Matthews, and Joy Reid. Her work has been published in outlets as varied as CNN.com, Refinery 29, and The Root. Nyira previously served as a senior director in the White House and senior advisor at the State Department, advising our nation's top leaders on issues of international security and diplomacy. Basically, I just said these really smart people are about to come on stage. And I'm very excited. Please welcome to the stage Rashad Robinson and Nyira Hawk. Hi. They're also wonderfully color coordinated, and I appreciate it. And two of the most stylish political organizers I know.
It's the hat.
It is the hat.
It's the hat.
You would rarely see Rashad without a hat.
He's hat and wear hair.
Thanks. So, brass tacks, we've been talking about anger. And we've had some extremely interesting conversations with both Tim and Jay about this concept of how the internet utilizes anger, how eyes are the attention of eyes, which obviously we just talked about, color of change, really having this digital and social strategy to bring eyes to issues that are important, as well as dealing with how we think about groupthink, the language we use, which is a big thing when you deal about hosting and media and getting the ears of folks coming in. You know, talk to me about what your perspective is about the utilization of anger when it deals with movements and messaging and communications in your work.
I think there's the individual piece of it, and then there's the collective piece of it. And obviously they intersect, but they're different. Individual anger can be cleansing, it can be purifying, it can be motivating. But to be purposeful, it has to translate into some kind of action at some point, right? So, I like to look at it as anger and its correlation with power. And what do you use your anger for? Are you using it to then protest, to volunteer, to build up communities, or are you using it for mob rule and for retribution? Which is I think that's the danger of the fire getting out of control, right? You burn up your fuel, and where does it go? On radio in particular, you can tell, and just in conversation, right, beyond just the internet, but that the anger expressed, the frustration, it translates as raw emotion, and people connect to raw emotion. It feels authentic. And they do that in political movements too. I actually think that anger is not just unique to this political moment of Trump or post, Hillary's loss. It is part of, and studies have shown, it is part of a political process writ large. It is what motivates people to actually go out and make change. But there's the flip side of it too. I mentioned retribution. And if you are incapable of hearing what other people are saying because you're so angry, you're incapable of including them, that doesn't lead to the best results when it comes to social justice or living together as a community. So to that, I would say, is the alternative emotion that you do need to drive any campaign or any message is hope. And I think we're lacking that now, right? When you have hope that something can change, then you're also motivated to do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot because, color of change, as you talked about, being founded in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which was a flood that was caused by bad decision makers that turned into a life-altering disaster by bad decision makers, right? Black people are literally on their roofs begging for the government to do something, and they're left to die, right? It illustrated a lot of things, right? There's a lot of things that kind of illustrate that geographic segregation, generational poverty, all these sort of issues that we already knew about. But at the heart of it, no one was nervous about disappointing Black people. Government, corporations, media are not nervous about disappointing you. And so anger alone doesn't make someone nervous about disappointing you. Someone who's deeply angry doesn't necessarily get someone to do something. Anger is not a trait, it is a response, right? And if your response is not backed up with the level of consequence, a level of power, to force institutions or people to do things that they don't want to do, then that is not effective. And so that's where strategy is deeply important, of really being able to understand what are the levers we are directing this energy at. We hear all sorts of things about anger, and there's a lot of false equivalencies that we end up in around sort of anger, right? White supremacists are angry, black people are angry, immigrants are angry, and who's angry about things for reasons that make perfect sense to be angry about it, and who's angry about things where you're like, there's no reason to be angry, right? We actually don't oftentimes get to see the mother whose kid has been ripped away from them at the border angry. We oftentimes we may see her hurt. We may see her sad. We also don't see her angry. Although we do get to see sometimes the person that has to press 2 for Spanish, and they get to be angry. And their angry is sometimes like validated as like that they're and allowed to sort of dictate maybe a public policy response or a lack of public policy response. And so, I think what's really important is the way in which power and who has power and who's building power undergirds all the ways in which anger is a force for change or just a response that doesn't actually move anything.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to this idea of flipping on a head. Like, what place does anger have when you think about human beings organizing and building community? Because when you think about the outrage that's caused by that image of someone on a rooftop, or that's caused by the image of the mother who is sad, who is literally losing a piece of her by seeing her child rip away, that outrage that's caused by, for lack of a better word, the news and seeing it, or getting an email from Color of Change, or hearing an interview with an immigration attorney who is dealing with this every single day. What is that anger and that outrage look like when trying to create change?
Well, it's also who's allowed to be angry and create change, right? Like there's the, I have learned in my aging years to appreciate the value of anger and not talk myself out of it. Right, and that in a very gendered way. There's a great book by a woman named Soraya Chemaly. It's called Rage Becomes Her. And she talks about that angry women in public get labeled as crazy, irrational, and it's not something that women are necessarily trained to consider an acceptable response in the workplace, whereas numerous studies will show you that your white male colleague is allowed to be angry in the workplace, and that's considered completely justified. Right, there's the stereotype of the angry black woman. Why is that a bad thing?
Well,
if that
I think
causes change?
that's a racial stereotype in general, with the ability of who gets to be angry and intimidation and threats. But I think also, and I leave this question back to y'all, does the anger that is motivated by this help organize this? Is this the catalyst, or is it an obstacle? Is anger purposeful?
So I would
Can it be?
I would say yes. I'm going to start with yes. I think it's a necessary function of response to injustice, but it's frustration versus irritability, right? Like the different type versus complete and total constant outrage, right? Even within anger, the whole spectrum of responses and how you channel it. If you talk yourself out of your anger, right? You rationalize it. There's a great study from the University of Toronto, and they used Trump videos and had people train them on how to talk themselves down from their anger, and they realized they were less likely to donate to a political cause, to feel like they needed to get involved politically, because they had talked themselves out of that emotional space. So there is a value to being centered in an emotion that is about changing and making change happen and combating injustice. And I think an easy way to call that emotion is often anger.
And so, how this works from an organizing perspective, right? So at Color of Change, we have developed a theory of respond, build, pivot, and scale. Respond to moments, build energy, find the systemic pivot, and then try to scale that energy over time. And right, so, we see, every single day we're hit with all sorts of information, from the internet to the TV to the radio. It inspires us, activates us, makes us angry, happy. If we don't give people something to do in that moment, they go back to doing what they were doing before. And so our goal is not simply awareness, it's translating awareness to action, right? In the service of translating presence, visibility into power, right? And so how that all works, right? And so if people are outraged by the fact that Sandra Bland was found hanging in a Waller County jail cell because she was given a $5,000 bail, and she was one of many black people that was given this sort of $5,000 bail because of a whole set of systems in Texas, right? The first thing people don't want you to do is say, let's work on money bail. Even though that is like a strategic thing to do. They want justice for Sandra Bland. And if you don't respond with justice for Sandra Bland, you are actually like working on something very different and not actually engaging in like people's like direct needs in that moment. And so there is no good organizing that can happen without actually meeting people's needs in some way, about giving people the ability to make their voices heard, to translate that energy. However, if you just leave people in response mode, that's like whack-a-mole. You know that game at the carnival where you hit something and something else pops up and you hit something else. You see, I've got a lot of energy. And, and I can play whack-a-mole for days and you never really win whack-a-mole, right? And so like to that extent, so much of the digital age, right, can be whack-a-mole. We can be kept in this like constant cycle of clicks and shares and never actually translate presence to power, because power is the ability to change the rules. Sometimes the written rules, sometimes the unwritten rules, because over time, changing the rules is scalable. That means that you've changed structures, and that recreates our ability to actually make change. Now, on the other end, our opponents are constantly using culture and narratives to do this. So we just released this study with USC. We contracted USC to look at crime procedures, the crime TV shows on air, and we looked at, and you can like check out the full report.
And this dealt with the idea of seeing the way the criminal justice system, because I remember looking at it, it dealt with how the criminal justice system is depicted on TV and how that actually is not giving a real actually depiction of the injustices that happen within the criminal system.
We actually called the report Normalizing Injustice because that's actually what these shows do, but to the extent of how it like connects with anger, right? So you watch these shows and the good guy is constantly doing bad things and getting away with it, right? And given a Hollywood speech to sort of like make you believe that the ends justified the means, that like the people in internal affairs just don't get it. The activists don't really understand. Like people who want a fairer system don't know how hard it is out on the streets. And as a result, we've got to bust some heads. We've got to step outside the law, right? And so if all white writers' rooms who, I would dare to say know nothing about what's happening in the streets, right? Law and Order SVU's writers' room set in New York City about sex crimes is all white and 60% male. Right? And so, but they have like created a narrative that all of these kind of things have to be done. And right, it will create then a set of anger at people who are fighting for justice, because then from a mental model perspective, we are fighting against keeping people safe. Right? Because we are fighting against a level of the things that need to be done to make communities safe, and we want something very different. And so the way in which anger sort of is used and weaponized through narratives to keep status quo systems in place, because if we disrupt the way that banking works in this country, it will be chaos, right? If we provide health care for everyone, all these crises will happen. Meanwhile, I was in, the drugstore today, online, watching as person after person is arguing about the fact that, like, they've got co-pays, they can't get the insurance, they can't get this, and somehow we've created this narrative of, like, people being angry about something being taken away from them that most people don't actually have in a real way. And so status quo forces are constantly weaponizing anger to keep their systems in place and using media narratives. And so for us, right, the trick is to not, and this is why the respond, build, pivot, scale is so important. The trick is to not be in constant whack-a-mole with all the things that come out of our way, but find the things that actually can drive participation. And so if we can get what we did was like 100 and something thousand people on a petition around Sandra Bland, and then build a narrative story about what was happening in Texas. And at the same time, build a narrative story about what was happening in Cook County and Laquan McDonald and Anita Alvarez not prosecuting and all the other things you can do. Then we can tell people, here's the next thing we want you to do after we've asked you to sign petitions and make phone calls. We want you to do voter contact with us, because the next thing is to take on the district attorneys. And then we ask people to pick a set of district attorneys around the country, and we're going to mobilize people and ask them to engage. And then over the course of the thing, we picked in 2016 7 district attorney races, and through our political action committee, we helped to win 6 of them in partnership with local organizations on the ground, increasing participation, which is really important, voter participation of young black people in each of those races, folks who previously never turned out to ever vote, or people who had only turned out to vote for President Obama, to turn out to vote for the district attorney races. Yeah. And so translating the presence of an issue, the outrage of an issue, into the ability to actually change the rules, to force systems to change. Anger was a key driver of people's participation, but if there was not strategy, if there was not infrastructure, right, the ability to actually give people the next thing to do and walk them along a theory of change, then what you leave is people deeply susceptible to continuing to support and replicate everything that the status quo wants us to replicate. And then what we get is a country with more black millionaires, but income inequality disparity widening, because we have taken presence and thought that it meant power. We have taken visibility and thought it meant something else. We have taken the fact that America loves black culture as the fact that America loves black people, and America can, hate black people and love black culture at the same time. And that's how presence versus power works.
So what I'm hearing is anger is complicated.
Yeah.
Outrage is necessary in movement building?
You can certainly look at, if we look at historical movements, you look at MLK versus Malcolm X. There's no doubt that they were both angry, but one channeled that as part of the message and as part of the agenda.
At least in his early life.
Right. And I'm not saying that that's wrong by any means. Actually, if you go even fast forward then to Nelson Mandela, there is absolutely anger, and even to the degree that it was disruptive to the status quo and to society was the necessary theory of change. How the status quo responds to that and who they co-opt and allow to be angry going forward, though, is where it's different, right?
Yeah, but I think, I think we sometimes tell, we sometimes, like MLK does not get us to the Voting Rights Act without Fannie Lou Hamer being outraged and forcing and creating a situation where he even had leverage to negotiate.
So anger has its place, and I think. But
anger is not going to get you the monument built.
Yeah, but the goal is not the monument. In fact, the goal, the minute we get monuments before we get structural change, we get presence without power.
You get the symbolism without the access.
We have museums and monuments, and I would take systems of structures that created and built equity and opportunity over museums. I don't want to have to choose, but
I'd rather have both.
But folks will always give you something sponsored by Wall Street and Walmart, so they don't actually have to give you everything that you actually need and deserve to be whole.
So my question is, we've kind of talked about this in regards to who gets heard. Yeah. I think is what we've heard kind of as a theme throughout this evening. Like who gets heard, how they get heard, what gets heard more. Anger seems to be, for a number of folks, because I think there's another thing that we kind of haven't talked about, which is this anger without an actual productive end. That exists
without being channeled.
Or even if it's being channeled, it's still not productive. It's being channeled for an objective. It may not be getting where it wants to go. Anger seems to be motivating some of the loudest voices in our country. And we've kind of talked about there being some alternative motives, right? Because there are other systems at play that are allowing these voices to be heard more than most, which I think a lot of people in this room may not have been aware of before tonight. Do you think that there is a privilege in anger? And I think you've kind of touched on this a little bit, Nyira. And, in considering what issues to deal with, is this, does this prioritize? Because I think you've also talked, Color of Change has done a lot with bail bonds, which for a lot of folks, if they really understand the system, it is a new form of incarceration, outside of just putting someone in jail, outside of just arresting them. You can keep someone in jail who cannot afford bond without indicting them almost indefinitely. And that's something that a lot of folks don't understand, and it is much more difficult to get that concept. Is there a prioritization because of these loud voices about what gets anger? Like what actually affords having anger placed on it?
Earlier talking about echo chambers, right? The right wing in the country has created an echo chamber that sustains itself and gets legislation and policy passed. The Unite the Right rally had police presence to allow their anger to be put on display. In Kentucky, you had a bunch of white guys showing up with AK-47s in the Capitol, and that was allowed. I cannot fathom that any of that would have been allowed for women of color or for just a community of black men doing exactly the same thing. And part of that is it's the relationship between the status quo power and who's allowed to be angry and express that in that way.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with all of that. And I do think, though, that as you think about building those sustainable movements, and I think this even exists on the right. I mean, I don't understand them as well as
it's not your ballywick.
I mean, it's not my ballywick, but I feel like I know enough to get myself into trouble. And
they do, but it is a fear-based anger. Their anger is based entirely in a fear of their power and their culture disappearing.
Absolutely, but they're and I don't want to speak for them. My goal really is to say that I don't think that people sustain in movements long term without senses of joy and aspiration. And at Color of Change, we have really rooted a lot of our sort of organizing and grassroots strategy, the work that we're doing locally around the country through our Black Women's Brunch strategy, through our Black Dads barbecues and Black community events, that is like building the sort of infrastructure that powers our electoral work, which may take on people that we are outraged with. It is rooted in Black joy. And Black joy is not the absence of pain, but it's the presence of aspiration. It's the presence that as much as I am against something, I am for something as well. I want to build something. And so, I think that all of these things should exist collectively. I don't think that Color of Change would have built a movement of, 1.5 million people who take action with us if it was just anger, if there wasn't aspiration, if we were just outrage, if there wasn't the presence of hope, and there wasn't the sense of fighting for freedom. But in the midst of all of that, you actually have to undergird that with strategy. You have to have wins along the way, and that is sort of part of it. I guess I'm just always conscious of that, yes, as from the outside, I too see a lot of the anger from the right. I also, though, believe that they want a set of things, too, for their families, that they want a set of things for their communities, and that there is a way in which hyper-capitalism has superseded democracy, and we're all being played against each other in ways that allow for folks to believe that there is a very narrow slice of the pie and that we're all fighting against each other. I mean, we are seeing it between Black communities and immigrant communities in all sorts of ways as well. And so, like, there's not this sort of sense that just because the right and the left have these problems, that we don't have problems, you know, on the left in ways in which we have been weaponized against each other because of a zero-sum gain and a way in which structures have been put in place to constantly protect rich and powerful forces and create incentive structures even for those on our side. Listen to some of the ways that some of the Democrats will be talking on the stage tonight, and one would have to imagine that many of them would have been against the New Deal. And not against the New Deal because it left out domestic workers and farm workers. They would be against the New Deal because it was giving away free shit to people. And like, that's what they would like be against it. And that's actually what we are hearing because we have accepted a set of ideas that have been translated into rules that make it really hard for us to build multiracial, powerful coalitions.
I think that is a perfect segue to open up for question and answers. We have a little bit of time. I see a hand up, so if we can get a mic. Hi.
Hi, my name is Adochi, and I had a question in regards to, like, we've talked about the psychology and algorithms of anger, and I was curious, how can we filter justifiable anger and mass false outrage in a time of call out versus call in culture?
I think that's a really good question because for the folks who don't know the difference between call out and call in culture, and you guys can add to this because I know that you both have vast experience talking about this, but call out culture is more of cancel this person now, and call in culture is when you kind of bring people in and you try to do this act of educating and this act of dialogue and conversation. And
that goes to your individual intent and purpose. How are you engaging individually online versus just responding to and carrying along with the mob? Are you piling on because you are now following this cycle of everybody else is saying this and I need to get in on this because now we're all just motivated and agitated together? Or is it really, what am I bringing to the table here? How am I contributing to this moment? And is that going to be in which I bring somebody into this? Or is it just not worth it for me? Do I personally just need to step aside because my anger has now pivoted not just to outrage, but where I'm burning, right?
So
I'm just burning the ground down.
Self-filter.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I think that's a big part of how we engage collectively is all taking individual responsibility.
This is a question I think about a lot. And so I really appreciate it. For the last, 15, 16 years of my life, I have
started this when you were 12?
Not just color of change.
Are we surprised the woman said self-filtering?
Not just color of change, but also GLAAD. I have gotten a lot of people fired. I have led a lot of campaigns to get a lot of people fired. And so I do think it does come down to picking the right targets, right? And it does, because I don't think that there should not be consequences, right? Like, I would lead the campaign as Color of Change to get Bill O'Reilly fired every single day and twice on Sunday, particularly on Sunday, because I felt like it was a deeply religious practice. And so would lead that and drive that campaign. And then there are times where I think especially during my time at GLAAD, where we maybe have missed the mark sometimes on things that were comedic and maybe didn't call people in enough who might have been trying to use satire or other sort of interventions and were allies. This is very tricky because who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak, who gets to make money off of communities who oftentimes don't have a voice. That all of that is really complicated, and it's even more complicated by the fact that oftentimes who dictates when a community has overreached or when a community has overstepped are not actually that community, but they are like status quo forces that can realign to say, oh, well, they just don't get the joke, or like they're outraged over nothing because their nothing hasn't actually become a something yet. When I started at GLAAD in 2005, what people could say and do and talk about LGBT people on TV and in the public space was vastly different than what it is now. And that would not have changed without people being held accountable. It simply would not have changed. And that has like created all sorts of new ways for young queer people to see themselves in different ways, to be able to think about who they were in different ways. You know, there are all sorts of ways in which Black people have been represented on, you know, I mean, from the first big budget movie to like today that actually has to be challenged. And I talked about crime procedures. You know, when we, you know, we've released this report and it's out in the public. And, you know, some months back, before the report came out, Dick Wolf, who created Law and Order and Chicago PD, and basically, if you ever watch a crime procedure, I know y'all watch them.
Basically, Dick Wolf.
Yes, his name is out there. They asked him this question at something called the Television Critics Upfronts, where the producers come and they introduce their new shows, and they're like basically trying to sell them to critics and all that. And a critic asked them about his shows. And sort of, do you think that they are, you know, irresponsible in ways about the criminal justice system? And he said, my shows are apolitical. He has shows with mayors, district attorneys, police officers in communities set in cities like Chicago and New York, and he can think that they are apolitical, right? And that is, I think, the trickiness about like how we deal with call-out culture or lack of call-out culture, right? Because part of the call-out is to force those who are profiting, those who have power to dictate our stories, to be accountable in ways. And honestly, like as someone who's like been doing this for a long time, like that doesn't change just by going and saying, please be nice. I remember like, you know, towards the end of my time at GLAAD, going to SNL with trans activists and sitting down with Seth Meyers and trying to explain to him why some of the skits that they were doing were like a big problem, and offering up like trans comedians who could be helpful in sort of like thinking about how to talk about the community. And like I almost was like worried as I was walking out. I was like, am I gonna end up in a skit? And then I was like, oh no, they don't have enough Black people at SNL, and so they like, I'll probably be good. And because, you know, we've ruled out blackface, and so we're like, you know, I could probably be good. And so, but I was like, and to a point now where they actively talk about SNL, how they're not doing it. And that is what narrative change looks like. Yeah. Narrative change is the rules and norms of society, what is acceptable and what is possible. And when we change the terrain between what is acceptable and what is possible, we open up all new opportunities for policy change, for culture change, for the ways in which we get to live in the world. This is not about creating empathy for people. Empathy gets us water bottles to Flint. Power gets us new pipes. Economic development, schools that work, tax policies that work. That is the difference. And I do think that at times you don't get that without creating the type of consequence that forces individuals who don't want to change their behaviors because they don't have to actually have to change their behaviors.
Wow. Well, that's a perfect way to end the show. Would do an amazing round of applause for Nyira Hawk and Rashad Robinson. Also for Tim Wu, as well as Jayvon Bayville, as well as Miriam and her amazing performance this evening. I think this is, you know, I have so many more questions. I hope that everyone here has so many more questions, but also some different perspectives about this malleable concept of anger and what it means to be outraged and how we react to it now, our impulses, the neuropsychology of it. You're going to go look at your phone completely differently now, and maybe leave it on the coffee table tonight, perhaps. I'm probably not going to. It's fine. So I want to thank you all for coming out this evening, and please make sure to check out greenspace.org for our next show next month, March 19th. I hope I said that right, Cameron. Yep. didn't say anything, so that means yes. So I hope to see you all next month.